It all started with an email, a short, impersonal message from the Homeowners Association, HOA, that made my stomach drop. They were informing me, in their usual formal tone, that my driveway would now be considered shared parking for visitors and guests of the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke or misunderstanding. My driveway, shared. The very idea felt absurd. This wasn't just any random patch of concrete. It was part of the property I had worked so hard to buy. I paid for it, maintained it, and relied on it every single day. How could they possibly think they had the right to take it away? I read the email 3 times, each word sinking deeper into my disbelief. The HOA president, Mrs. Evelyn Carmichael, wrote as if this decision was already final. There was no room for negotiation, no invitation to discuss. Instead, she ended the message with a cold reminder. Failure to comply could result in fines, or worse, legal action. It was like being scolded by a strict teacher who didn't care to hear your side of the story. At first, I tried to stay calm. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation behind this. Perhaps the HOA was short on parking during events, and they needed temporary solutions. Or maybe it was all a clerical error, and someone accidentally sent the notice to the wrong person. Surely, when I explained my situation, they'd see reason. After all, I'm not unreasonable. If the community genuinely needed help, I'd be willing to contribute, within limits, of course. But turning my private driveway into public parking, that crossed a line. The next morning, I decided to call Mrs. Carmichael directly. Her voice on the phone was clipped and impatient, as though she were speaking to someone beneath her. "Mrs. Harper," I said, trying to keep my tone polite despite my growing frustration, "my driveway is private property. You can't just decide to turn it into public parking without my permission." "Oh, but we can," she replied smoothly, almost smugly. "You agreed to abide by the HOA rules when you purchased your home. If you bothered to read them carefully, you'd know this isn't unprecedented." Her words stung, not because she was right, but because of the way she said them. She spoke to me as if I were a child, too ignorant to understand how things worked. And while her statement irritated me, it also piqued my curiosity. What exactly did those HOA rules say? Had I unknowingly signed away my rights to my own driveway? That weekend, I dug out the thick stack of documents I'd been handed when I bought the house. For years, they'd sat untouched in a drawer, gathering dust. Now, armed with highlighters and sticky notes, I combed through every page, searching for answers. To my dismay, Mrs. Carmichael was technically correct. The language in the bylaws gave the HOA limited authority over shared spaces. However, nowhere did it explicitly state they could repurpose individual driveways. As I flipped through the pages, anger began to simmer inside me. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. It was about principle. Who gave these people the power to dictate how I lived my life? Why should I have to sacrifice my convenience and my property for their benefit? By Sunday evening, I had drafted a carefully worded response to the HOA board. I cited relevant laws, pointed out inconsistencies in their argument, and reminded them of their responsibility to act in the best interest of all homeowners. Then I hit send and waited. What happened next changed everything, and proved that sometimes standing up for yourself comes with consequences you never expect. The response from the HOA came faster than I expected, but it wasn't the apology or clarification I had hoped for. Instead, Mrs. Carmichael replied with a curt email that dripped with condescension. She dismissed my concerns as misunderstandings and reiterated that the decision was final. According to her, the HOA's actions were in the best interest of the community. But what about my asterisk interests? What about my right to use my own driveway without interference? By Monday morning, I was already on edge when I left for work. The whole situation felt surreal, like living in some absurd bureaucratic nightmare. When I returned home that evening, though, things took a turn I could never have anticipated. My driveway, which should have been empty except for my car, was completely packed with vehicles. Strangers' cars lined both sides, leaving barely enough space for me to squeeze mine into the garage. Some drivers had even left notes on their windshields apologizing for the inconvenience, claiming they'd been told this area was available for overflow parking during events. I stood there, frozen, staring at the scene in disbelief. How dare they treat my property like a public lot? Who gave these people permission to park here without asking me first? It felt like an invasion, a violation of my personal space. And yet, no one seemed to care. Not the drivers who parked there, not the HOA board members who allowed it, and certainly not Mrs. Carmichael, whose smug tone still echoed in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those cars cluttering my driveway, mocking me. I knew I couldn't let this slide. If I did, it would set a dangerous precedent. What would stop them next? Would they start renting out my backyard for parties, or turning my front yard into a playground? The thought made me sick. The next day, I snapped photos of every single car parked in my driveway, making sure to capture license plates and details. Then I sent another email to Mrs. Carmichael, demanding immediate action. Her reply arrived within minutes, but instead of addressing the issue, she doubled down. "If you continue to resist," she wrote, her words sharp and accusatory, "we may need to reconsider whether your behavior aligns with the values of this community." Her tone infuriated me. Did she really think she could intimidate me? That she could bully me into submission by threatening my standing in the neighborhood? Maybe she assumed I'd back down because I didn't want to be labeled difficult. But she underestimated me. Big mistake. Over the next few days, I reached out to my neighbors, hoping to find allies. At first, many were hesitant to speak up, fearing retaliation from the HOA. But eventually, a few brave souls confided in me. One elderly couple revealed that their guest parking spots had also been reassigned without notice. Another family admitted they'd received similar emails months earlier, but hadn't fought back because they feared fines or other penalties. As I pieced together their stories, a disturbing pattern emerged. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was part of a larger scheme. Mrs. Carmichael wasn't just power-hungry. She was exploiting her position to generate revenue. By renting out prime parking spaces to non-residents, the HOA was raking in thousands of dollars annually, all while ignoring the needs and rights of actual homeowners. Fueled by anger and a growing sense of injustice, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board, accusing the HOA of overstepping its authority. But filing paperwork wasn't enough. I needed to send a message to show them that I wouldn't be pushed around. And then inspiration struck. On Saturday morning, I woke up early and headed to the hardware store. I bought large orange cones and a bold sign that read, Asterisk for IGTP Nino par ki ALLVD asterisk beneath it. I added a smaller note. Asterisk violators will be towed at owner's expense. Asterisk as I placed the cones at either end of my driveway, I couldn't help but smile. Let them try to argue with this. But little did I know, the real battle was just beginning. By Sunday evening, the orange cones and the bold private PROPERT sign were firmly in place. My driveway looked less like a parking lot and more like a construction zone. But I didn't care. It was my way of drawing a line, a clear boundary that said, this is mine and you can't touch it. I even went a step further, installing security cameras around the perimeter of my property to document everything. If anyone tried to challenge me, I have proof. For once, I felt like I was taking control of the situation instead of letting it spiral out of hand. But Monday morning brought chaos. As soon as the sun rose, cars began circling my block like vultures searching for their next meal. Drivers slowed down near my house, craning their necks to see if they could squeeze into my driveway despite the signs. Some ignored the cones entirely, parking anyway, and leaving apologetic notes on their dashboards. Others simply parked on the street nearby, clogging up the neighborhood and making life inconvenient for everyone else. Then came the complaints. A man in a suit stormed up to my front door, his face red with frustration. "What's going on here?" he demanded, pointing at the cones. "This is supposed to be guest parking. I've been told this area is available." I crossed my arms and met his gaze head-on. "Sir, this is private property," I said firmly. "You don't have permission to park here. Please move your car immediately." He sputtered, clearly unaccustomed to being told no. "But the HOA said." "The HOA doesn't own my driveway," I interrupted, cutting him off. "If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll call a towing company." That shut him up. He muttered something under his breath, but eventually got back into his car and drove away. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one. Throughout the day, more drivers showed up, each one angrier than the last. Some argued with me, insisting they had every right to park there. Others called the police, accusing me of vandalism or harassment. By noon, 2 officers arrived at my doorstep. "Ma'am, we've received multiple reports about this situation," one of them said, gesturing toward my driveway. "Can you explain what's going on?" I took a deep breath and walked them through everything: the HOA's decision, my attempts to resolve the issue peacefully, and the blatant disregard for my rights as a homeowner. I handed over copies of the emails between me and Mrs. Carmichael, along with screenshots of the HOA bylaws showing that nothing explicitly allowed them to repurpose individual driveways. The officers listened patiently, nodding occasionally. "We understand your concerns," one of them said after reviewing the documents. "However, disputes like this are typically handled privately. Unless someone breaks the law, there's not much we can do." Privately. That wasn't good enough. This wasn't just a personal disagreement, it was a systemic problem. And if the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they were dead wrong. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I turned to social media. I drafted a long post detailing my ordeal, complete with photos of the crowded driveway, the rude emails from Mrs. Carmichael, and the vague HOA rules. Before hitting publish, I hesitated for a moment. Was I crossing a line by airing this dirty laundry online? But then I remembered how powerless I'd felt just days ago, and how many others might be suffering silently too. Within hours, my story blew up. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers flooded my inbox with messages of support. Local news outlets picked up the thread, and reporters started reaching out for interviews. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was standing up for an entire community fed up with unfair treatment. Mrs. Carmichael must have noticed the growing backlash because she sent another email late that night. "This has gone far enough," she wrote, her tone laced with thinly veiled panic. "Let's find a solution before things escalate further." Oh, they were about to escalate all right, but not in the way she expected. By Tuesday morning, the situation had spiraled far beyond anything I could have imagined. Reporters were camped outside the HOA office, microphones in hand, demanding answers from Mrs. Carmichael. She looked flustered and defensive as cameras rolled, her usual air of authority crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, from neighbors offering support, journalists seeking quotes, and even a few curious strangers who wanted to know how they could fight similar battles in their own communities. But I wasn't done yet. While the media circus played out, I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands, literally. That afternoon, I contacted a local towing company and arranged for every unauthorized vehicle still parked in my driveway to be removed. The moment the tow trucks pulled up, chaos erupted. Drivers rushed out of nearby houses, yelling and pleading as their cars were loaded onto flatbeds. Some tried to argue with the tow operators, insisting they hadn't known about the rules or claiming they'd only parked there temporarily. Others directed their anger at me, accusing me of being unreasonable and vindictive. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost me?" One woman shouted, her face red with rage. "This is ridiculous. I stood calmly beside my driveway, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. "You parked on private property without permission," I said evenly. There were signs clearly stating that violators would be towed. You chose to ignore them. She opened her mouth to retort, but stopped when she realized there was no loophole to exploit. Instead, she stomped off, muttering under her breath about suing someone, though whom, exactly, she didn't specify. As the last car was hauled away, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. For weeks, I felt powerless, like a pawn in someone else's game. But now, I was taking back control, not just of my driveway, but of my dignity. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalks, some clapping quietly while others whispered among themselves. A few even approached me afterward to thank me for standing up to the HOA. "You're doing what we've all wanted to do for years," an elderly man named Mr. Thompson told me. His voice was soft, but filled with admiration. "We've been too afraid to speak up, but seeing you fight like this gives us hope." His words touched me deeply. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about setting an example. If I could push back against the HOA's unfair policies, maybe others would find the courage to do the same. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Later that evening, Mrs. Carmichael showed up at my doorstep, her face flushed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her usual polished demeanor was nowhere to be found. "You can't keep doing this," she snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Towing people's cars, posting online. This isn't how civilized people behave." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her theatrics. "Civilized people respect boundaries," I replied coolly. "Something you seem to struggle with." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But instead, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain composure. "Look," she said, lowering her voice, "let's put an end to this nonsense before it gets worse. We can work something out privately, if you agree to drop the drama." I almost laughed. Did she really think I'd cave now, after everything that had happened? After seeing the lengths she'd go to protect her own interests? I shook my head slowly. "Mrs. Carmichael, the time for private negotiations passed a long time ago. You made your choice when you decided to ignore my rights, and now the whole world knows about it." Her eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Finally, with a huff, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car. As she drove away, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity for her. She had built her reputation on control and intimidation, but now those same tactics were crumbling beneath her feet. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was winning. By Wednesday morning, the HOA's carefully constructed facade was cracking under the pressure of public exposure. News outlets had picked up the story, and it seemed like everyone in town and beyond was talking about Maplewood Court's parking fiasco. Headlines like "HOA Gone Rogue," "Residents Fight Back Against Overreach," dominated local news websites, while social media buzzed with memes and commentary about my standoff with Mrs. Carmichael. Even national talk shows weighed in, debating whether homeowners associations had too much power. Mrs. Carmichael, once so confident and unshakable, was visibly unraveling. She appeared on a live television segment that afternoon, flanked by two nervous-looking HOA board members. Her usual polished demeanor was gone, replaced by forced smiles and defensive stammering as reporters fired questions at her. "How do you justify repurposing private driveways without homeowner consent?" one journalist asked pointedly. "Are there financial incentives involved? Is this about generating revenue for the HOA?" Another chimed in. She squirmed under the spotlight, attempting to deflect blame. "This is not about money," she insisted, though her tone lacked conviction. "It's about ensuring adequate parking for our growing community." But no one was buying it. Not the reporters, not the neighbors, and certainly not me. The evidence I'd shared online painted a damning picture of greed and overreach. Leaked emails revealed discussions about renting out premium parking spots to non-residents during events, with proceeds funneled directly into the HOA's coffers. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about profit. Back at home, I watched the interview unfold on my laptop, shaking my head at her desperate attempts to spin the narrative. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. Public opinion could sway quickly, and if Mrs. Carmichael managed to regain control of the situation, she might retaliate against me, or worse, silence other dissenting voices in the neighborhood. That evening, I called an impromptu meeting with a small group of trusted neighbors who had been vocal supporters throughout the ordeal. We gathered in my living room, armed with laptops, notebooks, and determination. Together, we strategized next steps, determined to hold the HOA accountable once and for all. "We need to hit them where it hurts," said Mr. Thompson, his voice firm. "Their reputation, their finances, everything." He suggested filing formal complaints not only with the county zoning board, but also with state regulatory agencies responsible for overseeing HOAs. Others proposed organizing a petition demanding transparency from the HOA, complete with signatures from every affected homeowner. By the end of the night, we had a plan and a renewed sense of purpose. The following day, I delivered copies of our petition and complaint packets to every relevant authority I could think of. Each document included detailed accounts of the HOA's actions, along with supporting evidence like emails, photos, and witness statements. To make sure nothing slipped through the cracks, I personally followed up with phone calls to each agency, explaining the urgency of the matter. Meanwhile, the backlash against the HOA continued to grow. More homeowners came forward with stories of similar grievances: unexplained fees, ignored maintenance requests, and arbitrary rule changes designed to benefit a select few. What started as a personal battle over my driveway had evolved into a full-scale rebellion against systemic abuse of power. On Friday morning, the HOA held an emergency meeting, facing mounting pressure from the media, law enforcement, and irate residents. They had no choice but to address the controversy head-on. Dozens of angry homeowners packed the community center, their voices echoing off the walls as accusations flew. For once, Mrs. Carmichael didn't have the upper hand. When she tried to speak, she was drowned out by boos and jeers. In a stunning turn of events, the board voted unanimously to reinstate all original parking policies. Mrs. Carmichael resigned shortly afterward, her reign of intimidation brought to an abrupt end. As she left the room, shoulders slumped and eyes downcast, I couldn't help but feel a mix of triumph and relief. But even as the dust began to settle, I knew this victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had dared to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." The fallout from Mrs. Carmichael's resignation rippled through Maplewood Court like a shockwave. For weeks, the neighborhood buzzed with conversations about what had happened and what came next. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now exchanged warm smiles and friendly waves. It was as though a weight had been lifted, freeing us from the suffocating grip of her authoritarian rule. But while the immediate crisis was over, the aftermath left lingering questions. How did things get so bad in the first place? And how could we ensure it never happened again? In the days following the emergency meeting, I found myself at the center of attention, not because I sought it, but because people looked to me for guidance. Strangers approached me at the mailbox or stopped me during evening walks, thanking me for standing up when no one else would. Some even asked for advice on dealing with their own HOA disputes. At first, the spotlight made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to being seen as some kind of community hero, but as more stories surfaced about unfair fines, ignored complaints, and secret meetings, I realized my fight wasn't just about reclaiming my driveway. It was about restoring trust and fairness to our neighborhood. Determined to keep the momentum going, I organized a follow-up meeting at the community center. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the tense arguments and finger-pointing. Instead, residents gathered around tables, sharing ideas and brainstorming ways to hold the HOA accountable moving forward. We drafted a list of demands: transparent financial reports, clear communication about rule changes, and regular elections for board members. Most importantly, we insisted on creating a homeowner advisory committee to provide checks and balances against future abuses of power. To my surprise, several neighbors volunteered to join the effort, including Mr. Thompson, whose quiet wisdom had become a guiding force throughout the ordeal. "If we don't take responsibility now," he said during one discussion, "we're leaving the door open for someone else to walk through later." His words resonated deeply, reminding me that change only happens when people are willing to step up. As the weeks turned into months, Maplewood Court began to heal. The new HOA board, led by a retired teacher named Mrs. Patel, prioritized collaboration over control. They held monthly town halls where residents could voice concerns without fear of retribution. Slowly but surely, the sense of division that had plagued our community started to fade, replaced by a renewed spirit of unity. For me, the transformation felt personal. Every time I pulled into my driveway, a space that was finally, undeniably mine, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't just pride I felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the neighbors who stood by me, for the strangers who shared my story online, and for the lessons I'd learned along the way. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Mark joined me with 2 cups of coffee. "You know what," he said, handing me a mug, "I think this whole mess might have been a blessing in disguise." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "How do you figure?" He shrugged. "Before all this, we were living here, doing our thing, but not really connecting with anyone. Now look at you. You've inspired people to stand up for themselves. You've brought everyone together." His words caught me off guard, but they rang true. Before the driveway debacle, I saw myself as just another homeowner trying to live quietly. Now, I understood the power of speaking up, not just for yourself, but for others. And while I never wanted to be at the center of such a public battle, I couldn't deny the impact it had, not only on Maplewood Court but on me. Still, part of me wondered if the peace would last. Could we truly prevent history from repeating itself? Or was this just a temporary reprieve before the next storm hit? Only time would tell. But for now, I chose to focus on the present, the laughter of children playing down the street, the sight of flower beds blooming in vibrant colors, and the knowledge that, sometimes, standing your ground is worth every ounce of effort. Because in the end, it's not just about winning a fight. It's about building something better for everyone. For today, tomorrow, and the years to come. Months passed, and Maplewood Court transformed in ways I never imagined. The once tense neighborhood now felt alive with a renewed sense of purpose. People weren't just coexisting, they were connecting. Neighbors hosted block parties, organized weekend cleanups, and even started a community garden near the park. It was as if the shared struggle against Mrs. Carmichael's overreach had awakened something dormant within us, a desire to reclaim not just our rights, but our relationships. I often thought about how much had changed since that first email from the HOA landed in my inbox. Back then, I'd been frustrated, overwhelmed, and unsure of what to do next. Now, I felt empowered, not because I'd won some grand battle, but because I'd learned the value of standing firm in the face of injustice. More importantly, I'd discovered that courage is contagious. When one person speaks up, it gives others permission to do the same. That ripple effect was evident everywhere. I looked from the smiling faces at the community center to the freshly painted murals brightening the walls along Main Street. Still, the experience left me with lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life. For starters, I realized how easy it is to overlook small injustices until they grow into big problems. At first, I dismissed the HOA notices as minor annoyances, things I could ignore or deal with later. But those seemingly insignificant issues added up, creating an environment where abuse of power could thrive unchecked. If I'd stayed silent, who knows how much worse things might have gotten. Another lesson was the importance of knowing your rights and using them wisely. Before this ordeal, I hadn't paid much attention to the fine print in the HOA bylaws. Now I understood how critical it was to read the rules, ask questions, and hold leaders accountable. Knowledge isn't just power, it's protection. And while fighting back can be exhausting, it's far better than living under someone else's oppressive thumb. But perhaps the most profound takeaway was the reminder that fairness doesn't happen by accident. It takes effort, vigilance, and sometimes sacrifice. The new HOA board worked hard to rebuild trust, but I knew it wouldn't last unless everyone stayed involved. So I made a point to attend meetings, offer feedback, and encourage others to do the same. After all, a strong community isn't built by a few, it's nurtured by many. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood in my driveway, watching Ellie jump into piles of leaves with her friends. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys down the street. Mark leaned against the garage door, sipping coffee and smiling at the scene. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he said softly. "It does," I replied, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It really does." For so long, I'd taken moments like these for granted, the simple joy of being part of a place that felt like home. Now, I appreciated them even more, knowing how fragile that sense of belonging could be. Life is unpredictable, and challenges will always arise. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when people come together with honesty, determination, and heart, they can overcome almost anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the neighborhood, I took a deep breath and let myself feel proud, not just of what we accomplished, but of who we become. Maplewood Court wasn't perfect, and maybe it never would be. But it was ours, a patchwork of stories, struggles, and triumphs stitched together by the people who called it home. And nobody parks in my driveway anymore.